The stock market is, at its core, a probability machine. Every price on every exchange in the world is simply the collective judgment of millions of participants about the likelihood of future outcomes, discounted to the present, compressed into a single number, updated in real time. Markets have priced wars before. They priced the Gulf War of 1991, the Iraq invasion of 2003, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and every escalation cycle in between. In each case, the mechanism was the same. Analysts assigned probabilities to scenarios, modeled the economic impact of each, weighted them by likelihood, and arrived at a price that reflected the expected value of an uncertain future. That mechanism works when the distribution of outcomes is bounded. When the worst case is a disrupted oil supply for 90 days, a spike in defense spending, and a recession in the most exposed economies, outcomes that are severe but comprehensible, that have historical precedents and actuarial frameworks, markets can function. They reprice aggressively, they generate volatility, but they clear. On the morning of March 1st, 2026, markets woke up to a confirmed statement from the governments of the United States and Israel describing not a limited strike, not a targeted degradation of military infrastructure, but a declared operation, designated Operation Epic Fury, with an explicit strategic objective: the removal of the Islamic Republic of Iran's governing structure, regime change, not as a possible consequence of escalation, as the stated goal of the operation. The question that every risk desk, every sovereign wealth fund, every central bank in the world began asking simultaneously when those words crossed the wire is the same question this analysis will attempt to answer. How do you price the collapse of a nation of 93 million people that controls the exit valve of the global energy system? The honest answer is that you cannot, not with any framework that financial markets have ever developed, not with any model that has ever been stress tested against historical data, not with any scenario planning tool that assumes the range of outcomes has a floor. If that kind of structural analysis, the kind that goes beyond the headline and into the economic architecture beneath it, is what you come here for, make sure you are subscribed. What follows is not market commentary. It is an attempt to map the dimensions of an economic shock that has no modern precedent and no reliable pricing methodology. The first thing that financial markets are required to do on the morning of March 1st. Dr. Sinzminawa's first is distinguish between two categorically different scenarios that the language of geopolitical reporting tends to conflate. The first scenario is a tactical strike, the kind of military operation that markets have the most experience pricing. A tactical strike has a defined duration, a defined target set, and a defined end state. The attacker destroys specific military infrastructure, the defender absorbs the damage and responds within the limits of its surviving capability, and both sides eventually reach a point where the cost of continued escalation exceeds the perceived benefit. Markets can model this. They assign a probability to the strike occurring, model the energy market disruption, estimate the duration, apply a risk premium to affected asset classes, and arrive at a new equilibrium price that reflects the elevated but bounded uncertainty. The Hormuz risk premium, the aviation detour costs, the interceptor burn rate, all of these are inputs to a model that, however volatile its outputs, is at least structurally solvable. Operation Epic Fury is not a tactical strike scenario. It is a state collapse scenario, and state collapse scenarios are not merely a more severe version of the tactical strike model. They are a categorically different class of problem, one that breaks the mathematical structure of conventional risk pricing at its foundation. The reason is straightforward. A tactical strike assumes a counterparty. There is a government on the other side that retains sovereignty, retains control of its territory and resources, retains the ability to make decisions about whether to escalate or de-escalate, and retains, critically, the institutional capacity to manage the assets under its jurisdiction, including the Strait of Hormuz. A state collapse scenario eliminates the counterparty. When a government falls, the entities that were previously operating under its authority, military units, energy infrastructure operators, port authorities, maritime patrol forces, do not automatically transfer their loyalty and operational discipline to a successor. They fragment. Some align with surviving power centers, some pursue their own factional agendas, some simply dissolve. And, in the absence of a functioning central authority, the assets those entities were managing, including the most strategically consequential 21 nautical miles of water on the planet, become ungoverned. The financial cost difference between a tactical strike scenario and a state collapse scenario is not measured in percentage points. It is measured in orders of magnitude. The rational incentive structure that has kept the Strait open for 50 years is the incentive structure of a sovereign state with a functioning future. Remove the functioning future, and the incentive structure collapses with it. In military and strategic literature, this dynamic is sometimes described as the cornered actor problem, the phenomenon whereby an actor that has been deprived of all rational long-term interests becomes capable of actions that a rational long-term actor would never take, because the calculus of long-term consequences no longer applies to them. The cornered actor problem has been documented in every major state collapse scenario of the modern era. Saddam Hussein ordered the burning of Kuwaiti oil fields as coalition forces approached Baghdad in 1991. Not because it served any strategic military objective, but because a cornered actor with no future can still impose costs on the forces removing them. The Libyan civil war's effect on that country's oil production, which dropped from 1.7 million barrels per day before the 2011 intervention to near zero during the conflict's peak, and has never sustainably recovered to pre-war levels despite 15 years of attempted stabilization, provides the closest modern analog to the Iranian scenario. Libya is a nation of 7 million people with a relatively simple oil export infrastructure. Iran is a nation of 93 million people with a complex, partially underground, IRGC integrated energy and military infrastructure distributed across a landmass the size of Western Europe. The maritime insurance market's response to a Libyan scale disruption in Iran is not a repricing. It is a permanent withdrawal. The distinction matters enormously for the global energy system's ability to function. A repricing means that tanker operators pay more to transit, that energy costs rise by a calculable amount, and that markets eventually find a new equilibrium at a higher price level. A permanent withdrawal means that the 21 million barrels per day that normally transit the Strait have no insurable maritime pathway to market, that the alternative infrastructure, Saudi pipelines, Omani terminals, UAE storage, is capable of handling a fraction of that volume, and that the global economy's energy supply system faces a structural deficit that cannot be resolved through market mechanisms alone. The energy economists who have modeled Hormuz closure scenarios, and there is a body of academic and institutional literature on this specific question going back to the 1970s, consistently find that a sustained closure of more than 30 days would produce oil price outcomes that are not amenable to conventional forecasting. The models produce numbers, but the numbers carry confidence intervals so wide that they are analytically meaningless, because the scenario being modeled involves the simultaneous disruption of so many interconnected systems that the assumption of independent price discovery on which all financial modeling rests begins to break down. When crude oil cannot move, refineries cannot operate at capacity. When refineries cannot operate, petrochemical feedstocks become unavailable. When petrochemical feedstocks are unavailable, plastics production, pharmaceutical manufacturing, fertilizer production, and synthetic fiber production all contract simultaneously. When fertilizer production contracts, agricultural output in the following growing season falls. The Congressional Budget Office's retrospective analysis of the Iraq War, a state collapse operation that was also initially framed as a limited military intervention, documented a total cost to the United States government of approximately $2 trillion over the first decade of operations, before veteran care and interest costs are included. The Brown University Costs of War project, using a broader accounting methodology, estimated the total U.S. expenditure at over $3 trillion through 2021. That figure covers a country of 38 million people, with a GDP that represented a fraction of Iran's economic scale. Iran is a nation of 93 million people. Its territory is 4 times the size of Iraq. Its military and paramilitary infrastructure, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its embedded economic holdings, is significantly more deeply integrated into state functions than the Iraqi military was in 2003. And it sits astride the world's most critical energy transit corridor. A conservative analytical extrapolation of the Iraq cost model to the Iranian state collapse scenario, adjusted for scale, for the extended geography of potential stabilization requirements, and for the energy market disruption costs that Iraq did not impose on the global economy, generates a figure that no government budget office has ever formally modeled, because doing so would require acknowledging that the scenario being contemplated exceeds the financial architecture of the entities contemplating it. But the direct government cost of the operation is not the primary financial risk that markets are processing on the morning of March 1st. The primary risk is what happens to the Strait of Hormuz when the Iranian government that has administered it, however adversarially, ceases to exist as a functioning institution. This is the second dimension of the pricing problem, and it is the one that breaks every energy market model that has ever been constructed. The Strait of Hormuz has operated as a contested but functional transit corridor throughout the post-World War II era, for a reason that is not widely understood. Iran, despite its adversarial relationship with the United States and its repeated threats to close the strait, has never actually closed it. The reason is not that Iran lacked the military capability to impose serious disruptions. It clearly possessed that capability in various forms throughout the past 4 decades. The reason is that a functioning Iranian government had rational incentives to keep the strait open. Iran exports oil through the strait. Iran collects revenues from the transit of other nations' energy supplies through its adjacent territorial waters. Iran uses the threat of closure as a diplomatic lever precisely because closure would cost Iran itself dearly, and a lever that costs you nothing to hold is worth more than a lever you have already pulled. A collapsing Iranian government has none of these incentives. A leadership structure that is actively being dismantled by a military operation has no oil export revenues to protect, no diplomatic leverage to preserve, and no long-term institutional interests to weigh against the immediate tactical benefit of maximal disruption. When agricultural output falls, food prices rise across the global system, with the most severe impacts in food importing nations that are already operating at the margin of food security. This is the cascade that the phrase Hormuz closure actually describes, not an inconvenient spike in gasoline prices, but a sequential failure of interdependent systems that produces outcomes across a time frame measured in agricultural seasons, not trading days. The Monday market open on March 1st will produce numbers. Equity indices will move, oil futures will gap, currency markets will reprice safe haven flows, credit default swap spreads on Gulf sovereign debt will widen. Those numbers will be reported, analyzed, and interpreted as the market's verdict on the economic consequences of Operation Epic Fury. But the numbers that financial markets generate in the first hours of a state collapse scenario are not a verdict. They are a guess dressed as a price. Because the honest intellectual position, the position that every serious risk analyst will eventually be forced to acknowledge, even if the institutional pressures of financial markets make it difficult to state publicly, is that the economic consequences of the scenario now underway do not have a discoverable equilibrium price. They have a trajectory. And the trajectory of every state collapse in a strategically critical geography that the modern era has produced runs in the same direction. Costs that exceed initial estimates, timelines that extend beyond initial projections, and systemic consequences that propagate into domains: food security, refugee flows, regional power vacuums, proliferation risks, that were not included in the original risk model because including them would have required acknowledging that the operation being contemplated was not a military problem with a military solution. It was an economic and civilizational problem of a magnitude that no budget line, no insurance policy, no strategic petroleum reserve, and no central bank balance sheet was designed to absorb. The geopolitical hubris of assuming that an economic shock of this dimension can be contained within the borders of the country being targeted is not a new error. It is the same error that was made in 2003, that was made in 2011, and that has been made in every state collapse intervention of the modern era. The borders of states do not contain the economic consequences of their collapse. The energy that flows through their territory, the supply chains that depend on their stability, the insurance markets that underwrite their maritime lanes, the agricultural systems that depend on the fertilizers, that depend on the petrochemicals, that depend on the crude that flows through their territorial waters. None of these systems respect the political boundaries of the state that is being dismantled. They only respect the physics of supply and demand. And when supply is removed from a system that has no adequate substitute, not within any time frame that markets, governments, or households can plan around, the demand does not disappear. It simply goes unmet. Operation Epic Fury has a military objective, it has a stated political goal,